All right. Hey, I'm Dan Epstein. This is part of the baseball pandemic podcast. And I'm here with Frank Guridy, who is the association. Oops, let me do that again. I'm here with Frank Guridy, who is the associate professor at the Department of History and African American and African Diaspora Studies Department, Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University. And Frank has written an awesome book called The Sports Revolution: How Texas Changed the Culture of American Athletics, which comes out March 23rd via the University of Texas Press. And Frank, thank you for joining us.
Dan, thanks for agreeing to speak to me about my book. I've been been an admirer of your work.
Well, thank you. And I absolutely loved your book. And I mean, it definitely intertwines with a lot of the themes from my 70s baseball books, but I'm happy to say that it taught me some new things. And I love any book that connects the dots between things that, I've thought about for years, but never really went, oh, right, that. So big props to you for making me go, oh wow, quite a few times through the course of your book.
Well, I'm glad you're an expert on much of the period that the book covers, so I appreciate that.
Well, so obviously, we want to drill down into the 70s baseball aspect of your book, but I do want to say that it covers a wide spectrum. It's not just baseball, it's football, it's college hoops, it's professional tennis, it's pro football cheerleaders. You really cast your net wide on this, and I guess I'd like to just start by asking, like, why Texas and what brought you to this?
Yeah. So I'm not a Texas native. You probably can figure that out if you just listen to my voice for a few seconds. But I did teach at the University of Texas, Austin for 11 years, from 2004 to 2015. I now have family in Texas. My in-laws live in Texas. So I have personal connections and professional ones. And part of that is because when I arrived there, this was, these are more non-baseball sports stories, but Vince Young, the Texas Longhorn quarterback, was sort of in his heyday. They won the national championship in 2005. The Texas pro basketball was really in the midst of a renaissance with the Dallas Mavericks and, of course, the San Antonio Spurs. The Houston Astros were very much. They went to the World Series in 2005, right, with Clemens and that crew from that period. So there was a lot of things happening in Texas professional and collegiate sports. Texas, folks in Texas are fanatical about their sports, and not just football. So, part of it was just being in living in Austin, where I was living, and also visiting San Antonio a lot to visit my in-laws. So I was in there. I was in Texas at that time where there was a lot of great things happening and a lot of buzz around sports. So, and I'd never been to Texas before I moved there. So it was all new to me, and I became compelled. I really did. I really became compelled by, the sports culture there. It's super serious, super sophisticated, for better, for worse, and so it was hard not to be a part of it, to feel affected by that scene, especially at the time. I wasn't working on sports. My earlier work was on Cuban history, actually. So, but really, when it comes to the book, I decided to write this book because I did want to sort of provide two things. One, I wanted to kind of, for a non-Texas audience, and even for the Texans, to kind of create a book that is giving a slightly different narrative of Texas history, right? We associate Texas with, a lot of conservative things. We associate Texas with, the oil barons and all these narratives of the Wild West, et cetera. And this is a book that certainly talks about the affluent classes in Texas, but it's really talking about them in relationship to, the state's marginalized communities, the African American and in particular the Mexican American communities, right? But really, since the book covers the 1960s to the 1980s, you really cannot understand the expansion of professional sports in this country without understanding Texas's role, and in particular the role of Texas entrepreneurs, right? And you can't understand modern professional football without understanding the impact of a Lamar Hunt, a Bud Adams, and a Quint Murkiston. These are sons of oil barons who basically force themselves on the National Football League and eventually create the AFL in the case of Hunt and Adams. And then, of course, Murchison creates the Dallas Cowboys. The AFL brings in a whole bunch of franchises that forced the merger in 1966. That merger is forged by Lamar Hunt and Tex Schramm, who was the president of the Dallas Cowboys, right? So Texas sports entrepreneurs have a huge impact on modern professional football. You can't understand the expansion of professional baseball and Major League Baseball without understanding the role of Houston-based entrepreneurs. Folks like Roy Hoffines, who was a visionary who created the Houston Astrodome, which figures very prominently in this book. And as well as his partners in the Houston Sports Association, who brought Major League Baseball to Houston in 1960 with the Houston Colt 45s and then eventually the Houston Astros, right? So, by the book is trying to underscore the impact of those sports entrepreneurs, as well as the athletes who come out of this environment in a society that's passing through or moving towards an end of Jim Crow segregation, right? And so there's a lot of attention to Black athletes, their athletic skill, their performances, their impact. And so, to understand modern American sporting culture, certainly in the post-World War II period, you really have to account for the impact of Texas sports entrepreneurs and their athletes, right? And you see this even in sports media. Many prominent sports media personalities, people from Texas, people like Danny Dodd Meredith, Vern Lundquist, Phyllis George, who I talk about in this book. And then you see similar dynamics with the expansion of professional basketball, right? So as the Sun Belt is growing in American society, Texas becomes one of the first states in the South that brings professional sports to the state, to the region.
Right, and that money, that oil money, and it's so interesting to me how that winds up driving social change in the state, and then by extension through the entire Sun Belt, through athletics and this sense of like, okay, we are going to pay top dollar to transform our cities into these major league destinations, and to do that we have to bring in the best athletes available, some of whom may happen to not be white.
That's exactly right.
And that the fans by and large seem to accept that.
Yeah, certainly. And, part of that is because the book focuses on the major cities, right? I mean, one of the drawbacks is it doesn't focus on small towns. I mean, you could write an entire book, several books on high school football, which doesn't figure prominently in this book, unfortunately. There were some things I had to leave out. So the bulk of the book is on Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, right? And these are the cities that become, and certainly it's Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, major players in professional sports culture in this country, right? It's absolutely true. And they're also forced to come to those realizations, meaning the sports entrepreneurs, because of this is the era of the civil rights movement, right? So we see this really clearly in the history of the Houston Astrodome, which is a fascinating case, which I didn't know much about until I started messing around with some archives in Austin and in Houston. So Roy Hoffines and the Houston Sports Association, they want to bring Major League Baseball to Houston, but they quickly realize that they're going to have to let go of segregation, right? And they're forced to do that because in 1960 and 61, the sit-in movement is really alive. It's popping in Houston, right? It's it's following from the sit-in movement in North Carolina, other parts of the South. And so there's this deal made between civil rights activists and Roy Hoffines and the Houston Sports Association, in which they would, support, meaning Black voters would support the Astrodome Bond Initiative, which would provide public funds, $31 million to fund the building of the Astrodome, in exchange for a pledge that there would be no segregated seating, and that Black folks would have equal access to jobs at the stadium. This is a huge development, right? And so it's the entrepreneurs are farsighted, but they're also responding to what's happening on the ground with civil rights struggles, and we see this in other parts of the South. But it's kind of happening in Texas first, in a lot of ways, and that's what makes it interesting.
And that's one of those things where, like, I just reading, how you spell it out, it's like, oh, duh, of course. But I had never thought of Texas as sort of like, where it was, that it was going down there first, before Bear Bryant, bringing Black players onto the team in Alabama, or, any other place in the South where sports were, a major part of the culture. That, yeah, this was happening in Texas first.
Yeah, and that's the other part. The part of the story is that the integration of big time college football in Texas, and particularly the old Southwest Conference, which was basically one of the predecessors to what's now the Big 12. And yeah, and I mean the Southwest Conference is one of the last conferences to integrate, right? And the first schools that are integrating, who are either in the Southwest Conference or who want to join the Southwest Conference are SMU, Southern Methodist University, right, and the University of Houston, right. Southern Methodist had its glory days under Doak Walker in the 1940s, which I talk about in my Jim Crow chapter. But by the 60s, it was kind of, they were getting pounded by Texas and Arkansas every single year. And their head coach Hayden Fry understood that, well, if we're going to compete with these big dogs, we're going to have to find black athletes. And Fry's an interesting figure because if you read his autobiography, he says straight out, I'm from West Texas. I had black friends, and yet I couldn't really socialize with them at all. And I vowed that if I ever got in the position of authority, I was going to make a change. I was going to make a difference. I was going to be somebody who would be, facilitating desegregation. And that's what he does when he gets hired at SMU in the early 1960s. And he signs Jerry Levias from Beaumont, Texas in 1964. And Levias becomes this, extraordinary performer. He undergoes the trauma of integrating a white school in Texas in the mid-1960s. He went through a lot of shit. Yes, he did. And so it's Fry, and then it's Bill Yeoman at the University of Houston, who also is among the first to sign black players when he signs Warren McVeigh out of San Antonio in 1964, same year. Junior colleges and smaller schools have been integrating before. Texas Western, for example, the school that produces the all-black starting five that beats Adolph Rupp's Kentucky Wildcats in 1966 in the Final Four national championship game. So, but in the big time sports circles, it's really Houston and SMU that really pioneered the integration of college football. And Texas, really is slow. Texas, like Alabama, doesn't integrate until 1969, 1970. Right. And what you see in the trajectory of these programs that SMU and Houston ascend very quickly, and Texas falls behind, really. And it isn't until much later that they're able to kind of catch up to these schools that are integrated faster.
Right. They pay the price for their.
Yeah, they do. Absolutely.
Well, let's move on to 70s baseball. So of course, by the early 70s, Houston has firmly established itself as a Major League Baseball city. They've got the Astrodome. The All-Star game has been played there. The Astros are not a great team, but they've got some great players, including Jimmy Wynn and Joe Morgan and Rusty Staub, and it's like that they're at least legit, if not great. And then the Rangers come on the scene. Yes. And let's talk a bit about that. I mean, this is you set this up really nicely in the book. I mean, this is a case of of several different threads kind of coming together. You have the kind of corporate greed thread, where you have an owner, Bob Short, who, has owned the Senators for 4 seasons, and he's talking about like pulling, keeps making threats to pull the team pull the Senators out of DC, claiming, everything from a ballpark that doesn't suit his needs and is not up to date, to the the scary neighborhood that the ballpark is in, which is preventing white people coming to the ball games from the suburbs. Yep. And then he's getting, he convinces Arlington to pony up all this cash to bring his team from DC, and so we've got the team moving. We have one of the great 1970s baseball riots, which is the Senators' last night in DC, where the fans run out on the field. So let's talk about the Senators Rangers transition.
Yeah, so this is a funny story. I'm going to admit this. So this was when I was just starting. I had a chapter outline for the book, and I was committed to different sports, right? And I guess I assumed that I was going to probably write about the Astros because, as we talked about, we talked about the Houston Astrodome, which is something we could also talk about again in terms of its impact on stadium construction, in Major League Baseball and actually in all sports in this country. But I woke up one day, I was like, I don't have a chapter on Major League Baseball. I don't have a chapter on Major League Baseball. I'm like, that's not going to work. So, I had read Mike Shropshire's hysterical, irreverent book on the early 70s Rangers, Seasons in Hell, years back. And I thought, maybe I would, rather than write about the Astros, which, as you said, they have some interesting players, but the story of the Astros is the dome, essentially, until the late 70s when they really start contending, when Bill Verdon's the manager, and and then J.R. Richard and Nolan Ryan, that crew, they made the postseason a couple of times. So I was like, you know what? Let me focus on the Rangers. But in order to focus on the Rangers, you had to talk about the Senators. You had to explain how that even happens, right? How does Dallas-Fort Worth wind up with a Major League Baseball franchise? And how is it that the Senators, who have been created in response to the first Senators leaving from Minnesota, right? Calvin Griffith moving the Senators to Minnesota in 1960-61. So this franchise is an expansion franchise, and they're struggling, they're losing, they're persisting, and they're losing. And then in 1969, they have a really good year with Ted Williams as their manager, and things seem to be looking up. And oh, by the way, they have a new stadium, DC Stadium, which was renamed RFK Stadium in 1969. It's not even 10 years old.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. It was still fairly new by stadium standards.
So Bob Short starts making noise about moving pretty quickly. Like by 69, 70, he's already starting to complain about the things that you already highlighted. So, and then he moves them to Arlington because Tom Vandergrift, the mayor of Arlington, was a visionary. He had been trying to recruit major league teams for a while. He tried to go after Finley's A's when they were in Kansas City. He was at the White Sox as well. So he was letting the world know that Major League Baseball is a possibility in Dallas-Fort Worth. And he basically, ponies up the money and convinces Short to move his team to Arlington, Texas. And this is my read in the press. This is a shocking development. Nobody saw this happening, and it reverberates all the way into to Congress, where there's all these debates about, well, let's re-examine Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption. The politicians are really upset. How dare this team leave Washington for not Arlington, Virginia, but Arlington, Texas? Where is that, right? And Short's like, bye, I'm leaving them. And they're floundering around in those first couple of years. And of course, this is the infamous case of David Fry, the phenom, who they bring up right away to the major league level. He has his great start, and then he flames out because basically they abused him and they didn't develop him, right? And then suddenly in 1974, they become a winning team.
Right.
And become a winning team, not because of visionary management, which is the story that we like to tell often, right? But really because they made some good acquisitions, no doubt. They hired Billy Martin in 1974 to manage them. They bring in Ferguson Jenkins, who I talk a lot about in that chapter, right? And he, was seemingly on the downside of his career, and he has this extraordinary season. Comeback Player of the Year. He almost won the Cy Young Award. He wins 25 games. He does his thing, 20 plus to 30 complete games. He helps keep the Rangers in contention against the Oakland A's, the dynastic A's, who were in their third. At that point, they were ready to win their third World Series in a row in 1974. And so I just find this story interesting because to me, it's like they made some shrewd acquisitions, but they also fired Whitey Herzog right away in 1973. But it's really a story of just talent, just really saving a franchise, right? And I see Jenkins and Jeff Burrows is another. He has a great season in 1974, and these key other players, these Lenny Randall, somebody very well, I'm sure we could talk about him. And they somehow make it in Dallas-Fort Worth, even with really lousy management, because Bob Short sells the team. He makes his nice profit by selling the team to Brad Corbett in 1974. And Corbett is this kind of Steinbrenner-esque figure, right? Who is this brash guy who's going to sign players, especially after free agency comes, make transactions every year. They change the roster every single year in an attempt to compete. And the whole thing just, they're a competitive team, but they never win. They never were able to beat out the Royals in the American League West in those years. So, it's sort of this irreverent, rambunctious group, right? And I want to talk more about the rambunctiousness too, that is, contending in a moment when the game is in transition, right? And you see this, obviously, this case very well with free agency, right? And the changing composition of the athletic labor force. This is the point where, Black African-American players are almost 25% of the playing population. Latinos, the integration era has fully settled in or is still settling in. And you've got this enormous influx of talent. And then these guys are getting paid because Marvin Miller allows them to get paid through his extraordinary labor leadership, right? And so, so you've got this, rambunctious group of players, some of them Black, obviously white and Latino, surviving in Arlington, Texas, and they're the ones who basically allow the franchise to survive. And those, even though the management was doing everything to sort of torpedo the situation. That's my read on it.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because Brad Corbett is like a Steinbrenner-esque figure, but like what separates him from Steinbrenner? Was he just like not? Was Steinbrenner smarter? Did he just like do a better job of putting people in place who could move the team forward? Why does Steinbrenner pick up a mediocre franchise in '73 and turn them into world champions, and Corbett picks up a mediocre franchise in I guess around the same time, 73, 74,
That's right.
and just kind of spins the wheels until he runs out of money.
Well, I mean, to some degree, I think Steinbrenner and Gabe Paul, his GM, were smarter. They made some really good trades. When Brad Corbett takes over, it's almost like he's making acquisitions just to make them. At a certain point, they bring in Jenkins in '74, they sell him off, they trade him to the Red Sox, they bring in Gaylord Perry, they let him go. I mean, it's just it's a revolving door that makes the New York Yankees seem like a stable franchise. So part of it is that there's no continuity whatsoever, particularly by 75, 70. They fire Martin in 75. I mean, Martin wanted to get fired. I think he wanted to go to New York. So there's that, and then Steinbrenner signs Reggie Jackson, and the best free agent that they could get, the Rangers could get is Richie Zisk and Bert Campaneris, people like that. Reggie Jackson brings those championships to the Yankees. I mean, and there's no doubt about that in my mind. So some of that's luck, right? Because the Yankees don't win again once they let Reggie go into the 1990s, right? So something that even Steinbrenner lamented. So some of it's combination of luck, and I do think that the Steinbrenner and Gabe Paul made more astute acquisitions and trades than Corbett. Corbett is he's an interesting guy, and some of his players liked him. He had this interesting relation with Doc Ellis, as I'm sure right?
Didn't he help Doc get sober?
Apparently he did. Yeah, apparently he did. They give Doc Ellis a chance at a moment when most people are, not. He has a pretty decent, I think, 1977 season with the Rangers. I mean, the Rangers they finished in second place. They're not terrible, but there's not enough continuity there. They're changing managers constantly, again, making the Yankees seem stable, Right. And I mean, the Yankees have Martin 75, 76, 77, 78. That's, there's no Ranger manager that lasts more than a season and a half in that period, I mean, the famous case when he fires Lucchesi in '77, he brings in Eddie Stanky. Eddie Stanky manages one game, and then he's like, "I've had enough of this shit. I'm gone." And then he brings in Billy Hunter, who does a decent job, but then he lets him go next year. So there's no continuity at all in that period.
Well, speaking of Lucchesi, let's talk about you cover several important boxing matches in your book, but the Lucchesi Lenny Randle fight is I mean, I remember it so vividly from when I was a kid, and just like, what the fuck was that about? And and now like Lenny's a friend of mine now, and I just like, there's nothing in his personality that says to me this guy is going to beat the living shit out of his, or could have ever beat the living shit out of his manager, and yet that's what happened.
Yeah. It's spring training, 1977. Yeah, it's a fascinating case. I mean, the way I understand it is that it's in this context of free agency has just hit. Salaries are going up, right? And a lot of those big time free agents are black, right? And the Lucchesis and the Billy Martins and these guys who these white guys, to be honest with you, who are they've been able to make a career in the game. They get to manage a position, but they're not getting paid. They never got paid. And then all of a sudden they're managing these guys who are getting paid way more and probably entitled and, not interested in hearing from a Frank Lucchesi. So, and you see this in the quotes from Lucchesi. What jumped out at me is that the things that he says to the press, so Lenny Randle is upset because he sees that they brought in Bump Wills to replace him at second base. Right. Randle had been an effective player for them, like kind of a utility guy, but real solid player, did a lot of things well, tough guy. He got into fights in 1974 with the Indians that precipitated the infamous 10-cent beer night. But Lucchesi's telling the president, I'm sick and tired of these punks. Punks, that's the word he uses. Punks complain about not starting. If I got paid $100,000 a year or whatever he says, I would just shut up and keep my mouth shut.
Right.
So, looking at that in hindsight, like you can understand why Randall was probably pissed off, right? I mean,
Right.
his
So,
manager's perpetually, and then the media is eating this up, right? Because like, well, yeah, sure, right, and it's
right.
all over the press. And what's so fascinating about the Dallas Fort Worth, there's a huge army of reporters that are writing every damn thing, right? I mean, people who've talked about the SMU football scandal talked about the role of the Dallas press in highlighting that scandal in the 1980s. You've got a young, hungry cadre of sports reporters ready to jump on any scandal they could. So, this is in the press, and Randall, it lost it. He just goes up to his manager at the beginning before a game and just literally, he has a martial arts guy, strong guy, beats the guy unconscious, beats Lucchese unconscious. And that's the end of Randall's tenure in Arlington. It's interesting because he was actually a popular player. He did pretty well. So, I think he snapped, but I see that as this kind of tensions that you're seeing between these managers, these baseball lifers, suddenly now, looking on while people are getting paid, tens of thousands, $100,000. And this is a lot of resentment. And I think that's how I understand that case, and I think, I don't know Randall personally, but, I mean, it's clear that it's not consistent with who he was in terms of his team. Although he was a guy who was not afraid to kick ass too. I mean, he's a tough guy.
Well, and I see it also as like, kind of a classic case where there's a racial thing, and you've got the old white guy who doesn't know how to read the room, and doesn't understand that the word punk might mean something different in the Black community than it does to him. And then it's also, an old white guy telling a young Black guy to sit down and shut up.
Yeah.
Which, that's not.
It wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work. And, I feel for Lucchese because, he had to manage under Brad Corbett. That could not have been easy. He gets a job. He had a cup of coffee. He managed the Phillies, I think, for a little bit in 1971. But this is his big shot. And he's, working for this kind of crazy guy who's changing the roster every 5 seconds and changing GMs also, by the way. And then, he's confronting this new breed of ball player. He couldn't read the room. I think you're right.
And he's not exactly set up for success by Corbett.
No, not at all. No manager was really. It's a miracle that they were as good as they were. I think that, and I think that that's the takeaway for me. Like, in some ways, if they stuck to the plan a little bit more, they might have won a division championship. They had enough talent for sure. I mean, Ferguson Jenkins, that 74 team, I mean, he has some really good years in Texas. If he comes back from Boston, he wins 18 games. He's an effective pitcher well into 79, 80. And they had John Matlack on that 78 team. They had some good players. Rogelio Morey is an interesting figure in that story too. The Puerto Rican Roger Morey, relief pitcher who has a breakdown in the Texas Ranger locker room, and that's a sad case too. And I kind of read that as like example, not just him dealing with his own demons, but again, like, you see this still to this day, Latino players have no sort of support systems at all in Major League Baseball. And Rogelio Morey is an example of that at that time. He had his problems, but he has no support system, right? I mean, he's a guy who doesn't speak English. He's from, Puerto Rico. He's trying to save his career and he just snaps. Another person just snaps. There's something about working in Arlington, probably the heat.
Totally. Well, so that leads me to the next thing, which is I wanted to talk about, which is the, in Houston, you have the Astrodome, air-conditioned comfort, really like the first ballpark that's built, as much around the experience as you're going to a baseball game. It's like, you're sitting in these, I mean, I went to one game at the Astrodome in 78. I was driving with my grandparents from Alabama to LA. So, stop in Houston to see a ball game. And it blew my mind. I remember nothing about the game, but I remember, the theater seats and the home run extravaganza on the scoreboard. And it was just like, man, this is such a trip. This is so cool. And, the game didn't even matter. And then you've got Arlington's. It was
Arlington Stadium. That's what it was called.
And which is just it's a minor league ballpark they've basically jerry rigged to get enough people in there to qualify as a major league ballpark. And it's just a miserable place to play. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I mean, again, Vandegrift, he perfected the formula that a lot of elected officials, the mayor of Arlington, he perfected this formula that a lot of politicians do in the post-World War II period, is that they believe that if they bring professional sports to their team, to their city, right, that puts their city on the map, right? And they were able to corral millions of public dollars to, in this case, to renovate Arlington Stadium, which had been a minor league ballpark, right? And then, they kind of quickly put some seats in there just in time for the 72 season, their first season in Arlington. And then they expanded to, I think the capacity at that time was like 30,000 or something like that. Then they expanded in the late 70s to 43,000. They had a second deck, but there's no shade. It's this horrible place in terms of sitting through. I lived in Texas 11 years. It doesn't matter. If there's night games, it's hot. Pretty much all summer long. It's so funny. The booster press. Merle Herford says, and he's a writer for the Dallas Morning News. He says at some point, the games at night will be really comfortable. It's like, no, it's still 95 degrees at night in Texas in the summer. So and it's not like they needed a lot of seats because the Rangers didn't really draw very well those first couple of years. They barely cracked. I mean, their biggest crowd was David Clyde night in 1973. It's the only time they sold out until the 74 team gets good, and then the attendance gradually goes up. So. It's amazing to see how they were able to sort of, get a major league franchise with a ballpark that had no bells and whistles at all. It was not an Astrodome situation whatsoever, right? Yet that was kind of part of its charms. It had, I never went to see a game there, but I've watched, games. I mean, there's so many games on YouTube that you can watch now, including old Texas Ranger games. And, you get the sense that it was, it had that kind of minor league, kind of charm to it,
that great scoreboard they had.
They had a big scoreboard, but it must have been awfully uncomfortable to sit there and watch games, sit in the bleachers there, on a Sunday afternoon at 90 degrees in July or 100 degrees, that could not have been fun. But the fans came out. That's the thing. They came out anyway after a while. I mean, the franchise then goes back to being mediocre in the 1980s, and they revive, obviously, in the 90s. With Pudge Rodriguez and Juan Gonzalez and that crew, but it's that 70s period. The franchise really could have just went down the tubes, and somehow they're able to to survive. I think because they also provided a more affordable entertainment option.
Right.
The Dallas Cowboys are a rural North Texas, but most fans could not go see the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys are an uber expensive, proposition for most Texans. But the Rangers are cheap.
Once they move into their new stadium.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of it is that they provided affordable entertainment that was entertaining and compelling, even if it was a pathological situation there. In that period. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and they although I mean it's funny that you raise a point of going back to Bob Short bringing the team to Texas for all his squawking about the lack of support in DC. The Rangers basically draw the same amount of fans in 72 as the Senators did in 71.
Yeah, it's like 680,000 fans, showed up that first year. The opening night they win. Frank Howard hits a home run. They beat the Angels 5-4, 7-6, and it's all downhill from there. And poor Ted Williams is sitting there collecting a check, watching this team just flounder every single night. And then they let him go. After that, he had enough of Arlington. Why would he put up with that? He's a baseball legend, right? But then he hires Whitey Herzog, which is a smart move, and then he lets him go, right? So Short was all about the buck. I mean, like all owners are. But he had success when he owned the Lakers franchise, the NBA franchise, and he moved them from Minneapolis to Los Angeles, and that really established them as one of the premier franchises in the NBA. But by the time, he comes to buy the Senators, and a lot of this comes from one of his former employees, Shelby Whitfield, who writes this great book, who is just this merciless critique of Bob Short. It's Kiss It Goodbye or something like that. I forgot the title right now. I can't remember off the top of my head, where he just traces Short's shenanigans from the minute he takes over the franchise until he moves him to Arlington. And and it's also in that period where there's all these debates and this anxiety about Major League Baseball losing its popularity vis-a-vis the National Football League, professional football, right? And so, like the Senators leaving, the nation's capital signified to a lot of people in the baseball press that, oh man, baseball is losing its popularity. The National Football League has Monday Night Football. They have primetime television. They are skyrocketing in popularity, and there's a lot of concern about baseball in that period. You know this well. I mean, you see this throughout the 70s until free agency comes. And so like the loss of the Senators, this iconic franchise, even though it wasn't a winning franchise, but it certainly had this symbolic place in sort of American baseball culture, presidential politics, presidents would throw out the first balls, et cetera. And for them to leave, it just signified like, oh, what's, like nothing's sacred now, and we've got these greedy owners who are just after a buck and they're taking their franchises to different parts of the country. Like Charlie Finley takes the A's from Kansas City to Oakland in 1968. And so part of what I talk about there is it's this deep, just concerned about the fate of the game.
And but then it's interesting that they go to the Dallas Fort Worth area, which is so football mad. Yes. And North Texas in general, just like it's such football territory that here's this major league team, this baseball team in a major league that is allegedly losing ground in the hearts and minds of Americans, and yet they're able to kind of burrow in and hang on.
Yeah. I mean that's what makes it interesting, and it surprised me. I never thought I was going to write about the Texas Rangers, but it is interesting. I think I'm concerned about this. I think throughout the book, what makes franchise successful, right? Usually we hear the story of the great owner, the great visionary general manager, the Branch Rickey figure, or whoever, the Billy Beans, or whoever your GM genius is, or whatever historical period you're talking about, right? But it's this delicate balance between visionary management, athletic talent, right, and and a kind of a sensibility that your ball club or your franchise has something to offer the broader public, and sometimes you don't always have those combinations, and I'm not sure that the Rangers had it all. They had enough talent, I think, too, because you've just got this. By the time the 70s are happening, you've got this influx of talent. You've got just all kinds of talent that's changed the game. You wrote about this yourself, right? Line drives and stolen bases, and there's a lot of excitement. As part of that is facilitated by artificial turf too. The Rangers don't have a natural grass field at that time, but and so I think the franchise that did well. I talked about this with the San Antonio Spurs in the case of the ABA NBA. When you have management that kind of understands that it's not just about the dollar. Obviously, the dollar is the most important thing. Then you usually have success, more often than not.
There's a cultural aspect.
Yeah. And somehow the Rangers are able to do it, even despite management. I guess is what I'm saying, whereas I think most of the time I get really sick and tired of hearing, about, genius GMs, making everything happen, and they don't. It's the players. It's this delicate balance that makes a franchise successful, in my opinion.
Yeah, and of course in the 70s you start seeing the players like rewarded more equitably for their contributions to that degree.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, in the case of the Rangers, most of their free agents, Matlack is decent. None of those players, really become hits. They have even Bobby Bonds for half a season. This is one of Bobby Bonds' post San Francisco Giants stops. I forgot that he had played for the Rangers in 1978. Everybody's coming through Arlington. It seems like in that period,
will stick.
Yeah, and they don't stay very long, and they're probably not that unhappy about that. Jenkins is interesting because he kind of, since he has a rural background as a Canadian, he's able to kind of, have a decent life. I think he lived in the region after he retires, if I remember right. So he becomes sort of a, even though we associate him with his success with the Cubs, he has some good years in Arlington, and he has a good relationship with the region. He does. Well, but a lot of those players are coming and going. They're not sticking around very long. Yeah.
I think Fergie's personality too held him in good stead in that regard. He was a very, he was kind of the opposite of Doc Ellis, at least in the sense like he was just very even keel, very just like, let me do my job, let me get out there, let me go 9 innings, and we're cool. And
one of the great sources that really helped me in this chapter is that great Canadian documentary, King of the Hill, which is you can watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, and you get such a great snapshot into Major League Baseball in 73, 74, and Jenkins in particular, because he's the central figure in that story. So, and you appreciate his skill set. The only sport I played, pretty decently was baseball, and I pitched. So I love Ferguson Jenkins, right? Because he was just a craftsman. He just worked those hitters. He worked fast. He did his slider, did his fastball, worked the counts, gave up his home run when it didn't matter very much, like Catfish Hunter, very similar in that sense. but he got people out and he won a lot of games. And to sort of to see that in that documentary, like, it was awesome. Even though he's not having good years in that period, that's at the end of his time with the Cubs, but you still see the master at work. And, you know, as somebody who just loves pitching, you know, it was hard not to fall in love with Jenkins, you know. And I also think he's overlooked. You know, we look at the great, you know, Cy Young Award winners in that period. Obviously, the Seavers and the Palmers, you know, deserve all the recognition they get. But Jenkins is a phenomenal pitcher for a long time, you know. So this is almost my little homage to him, you know, too, in this chapter.
Yeah, which I think you put across really nicely. And in general, like, one of the other things I really enjoyed about this book is that, you know, you really, you know, spell out and explain all the social stuff, you know, how it's all kind of intertwined, the economic stuff. But then when you get to like actual sporting events, you recount them in a very exciting way. Like, it's, you know, it's sort of like, if you're, you know, if you're not somebody who generally reads books on, you know, the economic or social side of sports, like, you know, I could see you're still really getting into this book because, you know, just, you know, your descriptions of, you know, whether it's the, you know, the game of the century basketball game at the Astrodome in '68, or the, you know, Muhammad Ali's 3 fights at the Astrodome, or, you know, or just, you know, various college football games, like it made me want to go back and watch those things, or like see if those videos are there on YouTube. So, I mean, I get, like, I wanted to ask, like, what for you was the most fun part of this book? Was it going back and watching these games?
Yeah, it was. You know, it's funny because, you know, Deborah Paredes, my wife, is a poet, and so you know, so we both work on our books all the time. And she would tell you, and I put in my acknowledgments that, you know, she had to suffer me through the writing of the book because I'm very cranky when I write books. I don't know how you are, Dan, but, you know, it doesn't feel like fun a lot, and then it's over. But, you know, what was fun, yes, is, you know, this book and everything I have done in my work and I will continue to do was made possible by the internet. Because, you know, the YouTube is an incredible source for me because it allows me to reconstruct games. I don't have to just rely on, you know, the game accounts in the press. So, you know, for example, like, and, you know, and there's tons of Major League Baseball games, random games that are on the internet now. Like, so like my recreation of that last Senators game is because the radio call, that great radio call, is on YouTube, and it's just great theater, you know. So that was fun. You know, the David Clyde game is also available. Every game I wrote about, pretty much I've reconstructed from, you know, some video that I found somewhere in the internet, often YouTube videos. The Billie Jean King Bobby Riggs match, which I talked about in my tennis chapter, that I had to go to the Paley Center to reconstruct. It's the only place you could see it for whatever reason, probably copyright reasons. Yeah, you know, so it was fun. And this is a book that I really tried to, you know, take my scholarly training that, you know, highlights, I'm an African-American studies scholar, a history scholar. And so I want to sort of portray sports in a critical light, no doubt, right? The business of sport in particular. But I'm very influenced by sports writing traditions, right? I mean, the best sports histories are written by journalists and people who are not professional historians, in my opinion. So I really tried to bring in the kind of the sports writer's attention to performance, you know, because that's what makes sports compelling to me, is seeing people do their thing live or on television. And so I wanted that in the book, you know, and I want people who, you know, maybe, you know, who are critics of sport, who a lot of my colleagues in academia are very critical of sport, to sort of see the appreciation and skill of athletic labor and coaching, you know, because in the end of the day, that's what makes it compelling. You know, your GM can make all the right moves, but if people don't do their thing on the field, then nobody's going to watch, you know. And so, so I want, in order to appreciate, you know, Jerry Levice's impact as the first Black scholarship football player in the Southwest Conference, you know, yeah, I spent some time talking about this incredible kickoff punt return that he does in 1966. As an exemplar of the ways in which to demonstrate that, you know, all these skeptics were saying that, well, Black players can't play with white players in Texas football. And that punt return happens because his white teammates block for him and because he's an enormously skillful performer.
Yeah.
And I do similar stuff in, you know, pretty much every single chapter. You know, I've even talked about Doak Walker's, you know, performances in the Cotton Bowl in the late 1940s too, you know, because that's what makes sports compelling. And I really wanted that to be part of this book.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, explains that kind of stuff explains why, you know, like it's sort of like, what am I trying to say? It's like that's kind of the root of all of it. It's like all of these other forces that swirl around it. Ultimately, it comes down to, like, you know, people give a shit because it's so fucking exciting.
Yes.
When these things, you know, when you get these players who are, you know, just, you know, a cut above, and just, you know, and you watch them do their thing, and maybe you don't, you know, live and die by the box scores. Maybe you don't have a subscription to Sports Illustrated or ESPN.com or whatever. But like, when you see somebody, you know, who's really, you know, playing at a whole other level than everybody else on the field or on the court, it's incredibly compelling.
It is. Yeah, it is. And, you know, I mean, the other part of the story is the impact of television. Because what makes the sports revolution happen, and what makes this a national phenomenon, is television, right? Is the expansion of television, you know, network television, then eventually cable TV in the 1980s and afterwards. And so that, you know, more Americans could see what's happening, you know, the changes, the cultural changes in American society, in the sports world, on television, right? And that explains the popularity of so many of these athletes and teams. And certainly that explains the popularity of the Dallas Cowboys football franchise, no doubt. Tex Schramm understood, as a former media guy, that TV was super important, right? And he thought, you know, down every detail. You know, the design of Texas Stadium, the new stadium that the Cowboys moved into in 1971, was a TV-ready stadium, right? You know, the artificial turf was sort of laid out in a certain way. The walls were painted in a certain way. Players had certain uniforms. You know, Tex Schramm was all about television.
Right.
And you know, once Major League Baseball and certainly the NFL go prime time, you know, then, you know, Americans are able to see these Black athletes and Latino athletes, you know, playing with white athletes, and that has an impact on American society. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? In ways that, you know, radio had a similar impact, but that's one of the legacies of that period, is that you see the proliferation of franchises, you see stadiums being built all over the place in the 60s and 70s. And you're seeing new leagues come into play, the AFL, the new expansion franchises, the ABA, you know, et cetera. Women's professional tennis pro tennis is arising in that period. And all of it's on television. And that has an enormous impact on our understanding of what sport is, and even our understanding what American meritocracy. You know, so we have an investment in this belief that, you know, there's an equal playing field out there. And that's because we've seen compelling evidence that sport can bring people together, you know, when it happens right. And it's often, if it's not live, you see it on television.
Well, I could talk with you about this stuff all night, pretty much. But I thought a good place to finish would be to talk about a little bit more about the Houston Astrodome, and how, like, it, you know, it is really so influential in the way that on how subsequent stadiums are built. And then ultimately it's, you know, it becomes a victim of its own success.
Yeah, the Astrodome has a gigantic effect on stadium construction in this country, right? So on the one hand, it looks like, you know, the stadiums you wrote about in your books, Dan. You know, the cookie cutter multi-purpose stadium, right? You know, with the movable box seats, you know, the multi-tiers, you know, arrangement. But it's the first indoor dome stadium, right? In the United States. And so technologically, it's advanced. It's an homage also to the gas energy elite in Texas, right. Too, you know.
Right. Well, because it's the first, as far as I know, it's the first stadium with luxury boxes.
That's right. So that's the thing I was going to say. So the legacy of the Astrodome is the introduction of the luxury box, and no stadium built afterwards doesn't have luxury boxes. Maybe Foxborough Stadium, you know, which was a cheap, you know, construction in suburban Boston, is one of the few, but all of them after that have the luxury suites. So the genius of Roy Hoffines, you know, who's, you know, was really the force behind the Astrodome, is that, you know, he understood he wanted the corporate crowd, but he understood he needed the working man, the working class crowd, right? And so the Astrodome, you know, sells itself as this place that provides comfort for all fans, right? And it does. It absolutely does, right? I mean, players probably didn't like it that much. They had to figure out how to watch those fly balls, you know, fly balls, you know, coming down from the roof after they painted the roof. It was still hard. Artificial turf, not a great surface to play on. Home run hitters hated it because it was a gigantic ballpark. But it introduces the concept of the luxury box and the dome and artificial turf, of course, which is another unfortunate legacy of the Astrodome. But it puts Houston on the map. Houstonians love it because the Astrodome hosted all sorts of events there, not just Astros, football, the livestock rodeo, concerts, etc. Black college football, on and on and on. Everything had Selena concerts. This is one of Selena, the pop star's most famous performances. It happens in the Astrodome in 1997. And then it gets taken over in the 1990s, and it becomes obsolete because one, the multi-purpose paradigm, fades away because most team owners want their own facilities, particularly the football franchise. They don't want to share stadiums anymore with Bud Adams would never like the Astrodome, right, the owner of the Houston Oilers. So, the NFL wants their own stadiums. And then, Camden Yards changed the game. The construction of the ballpark at Camden Yards in 1991 completely changes the paradigm of stadium construction. So the retro downtown ballpark becomes predominant, and the multi-purpose ballpark becomes obsolete. And then everybody wants one of those. So it's in the 1990s and after, you just see this proliferation of single-purpose stadiums. They're not really single-purpose, but that's how they're built as a result. And then the Astrodome basically fades away. It's still standing there. Harris County doesn't have the guts to tear it down because Houstonians love the dome. It has just such a huge impact in the life of that city for a long time. And so the Astros leave for what's now Minute Maid Ballpark, before that Enron Field, in 2000. And then the dome's been just sitting there pretty much empty ever since. It's this classic white elephant. It's kind of sad because you would think that there'd be some way that facility could be repurposed. But as time goes on, it's clear that I think it's just going to be torn down eventually.
What's the name of the football field that's built right next door to it?
Okay, so the corporate sponsorship names changed. So it was Reliance Stadium for a long time, and I think it has another name. It's the home field of the Houston Texans NFL franchise. It sits right next to the Astrodome. Towers over it. I have this image of that.
Which I was going to say. I went back to Houston for the first time since my Astros game in '78 in 2003. I was there to cover ZZ Top playing Rodeo Houston at Reliance Stadium. Yeah. And I remember just as a kid seeing the Astrodome, and it was just out in the middle of nowhere, just this, space age bubble, gigantic, booming over the entire landscape. And then to pull up again, I guess that would be 25 years later, and seeing it dwarfed Fire Reliance Stadium was such a trip, and so sad. It is sad. And I think people like to critique the multi-purpose so-called suburban stadiums of the 60s and 70s, but I read a great book by Dan Rosenzweig. It's called Retro Ballparks. It comes out in 2002. And it's a critique of the retro ballpark, right? He writes about, at the time, he writes about Camden Yards, and he writes about Jacobs Field, which is now, I think, Progressive Field, the Indians' home stadium. And he writes very insightfully about the kind of manufactured nature of the urban experience at these retro ballparks. And he makes the case that I absolutely agree with, which is that those ballparks back in the day, were more accessible. They had a wider array of people show up at ball games. The layout, the bleacher seats, they were just way more accessible to a broader public than the modern stadium is today. And that's what we've lost. That's what Major League Baseball has lost. The Astrodome had the bells and whistles and the amenities, but it still had, even in that air-conditioned comfort, the kind of rough edge proletarian ethos. And you don't really see that in today's ballparks most of the time. At least I haven't seen it. Well, and I think also, and perhaps he gets into this, but I think the pricing, ticket pricing, it's like back in the '60s, you could afford to bring a family of four to a game at the Astrodome, even if you were, a middle class worker, and it's like, or like the Oakland Coliseum was another example where it's just you could support the area, even if it was predominantly middle class or working class, could support a team like that. Yep. Now it's you're lucky if a family of four can afford to go to 2 ball games a year.
Yeah, and that's been the case for some time, but it's just gotten more extreme. It's just gotten more extreme as the premium sections have gotten more and more predominant in these new stadiums, and as the capacity has shrunk. Those stadiums just to hold 50, 60,000 people now. The current ballpark holds 30 to 40,000. We've lost that, and that's a shame. And I think certainly it's wonderful to go to a nice ballpark with amenities, but people don't go to the ballpark to eat garlic fries. They go to see people perform. And as somebody who's a child of working class parents, my parents didn't even finish high school. we were fairly regular attendees at Mets and Yankee games in New York City, and those days are gone. And you can see that when you go to a Yankee game today. Yankee Stadium does not have the same constituency that it did, when the Puerto Ricans are running the bleacher sections, throughout my youth, and I was too afraid to sit in the bleacher section. I was more inclined to sit in general admission because I couldn't hang with those guys. They were too rough. And sometimes I wasn't good, sometimes they were a little too rough. But, but at the same time, it was just great to feel like as a kid, I could go to games. And, I think we've lost that. But not just Major League Baseball. That's just a sign of our society in general, I think.
Absolutely. Well, before I let you go, any last things you want to say about your very fine book?
Well, thanks, Dan. I just think that, my hope is that, I decided I could have wrote this book about one sport, and the logical sport to write about was football. But I didn't want to write just another book about Texas football, and so I hope that the reader, appreciates the multi-sport approach, so if you're not into tennis, if you're not into basketball, then, I guess you could skip those chapters. But I think to think about baseball's history in relationship to this broader phenomenon that I call the sports revolution, this transformation of American sporting culture, I think the baseball, reader will appreciate, baseball's place in that dynamic. And more importantly, and as importantly, Texas's role and the Astrodome's role in making Major League Baseball what it becomes, in subsequent decades. So I think, that's sort of my summarizing comment that as for people who would read a book as a baseball fan, I think those are the takeaways I'd like them to consider, among other things they could find in the book.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, man. And congratulations.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate your energy, your time, and I love chatting with you. I look forward to more conversation in the future.
Absolutely. Well, next time I'm in New York, we will have to do this in person.
Well, I look forward to reading your new book. The Bloomberg collaboration looks, fascinating. So I'm looking forward to reading it, The Captain and Me.
Cool. Yeah. No, I think having grown up going to Yankee games, you'll definitely find a lot to dig. And going to Shea Stadium, there's a lot in there about how miserable it was for the Yankees to make that adjustment. So it's pretty funny.
I look forward to reading it.
Right on, man.
All right.
Have a great night.
You too. Take care.
Right on. Bye-bye.